What recently presented this issue to me in especially compelling form was an old friend's death from cancer. He was a very intelligent and convinced atheist who had over years been coming little by little to take the claims of Christianity more and more seriously and entertain the thought that perhaps all the things he valued in life might be meaningless without the support of some kind of transcendental grounding. He'd watched my own development as a Christian with wary curiosity, and notwithstanding his deep-seated aversions, our friendship seemed to deepen over the years. I thought it likely that someday we would have a serious conversation about it all. I believed he would listen to me, and I wanted to be ready for his questions when the time came. When he was diagnosed with the cancer, and it was clear he might not have long to live, I thought the conversation would be coming soon. And so I consciously began to prepare for it. I visited him repeatedly in his last days, each time hoping that this would turn out to be the moment when the conversation would occur. But I always left it up to his initiative, and it never did. Maybe in the end, he just didn't want to have the conversation. Not that he was especially reticent in speaking about death. On the contrary, he practically reveled in it. But he was an exceedingly stubborn man, and it would have been for him a confession of weakness to allow the mere fact that he was dying to be the cause of his reconsidering a lifetime's worth of settled opinions. In any event, there was another reason why the conversation didn't happen. And that was because he was too preoccupied with other matters. He was preoccupied with an exhaustive search for a possible cure for his affliction. All over the country and the world at any given time, there are countless clinical trials going on, drugs being tested, therapies being experimented with, miracle cures being explored and touted. It's a full-time job, as some of you may know, just to research them all and sort through the conflicting claims, decide which one to try, and then to get oneself admitted for participation in the trial. He was understandably preoccupied with this search every time I saw him, and remained so until very near the end. As it was, he died in his bed at a prestigious hospital in New York City of an opportunistic infection that he had contracted in the hospital while awaiting his treatment for the cancer. A particularly hard irony. Thankfully, he died in the presence of his wonderful family, and at the end he spoke to them of an inner serenity once it was clear that all the pondering and choosing was over. And that thought is some comfort to me. Still, I was left wondering whether he really had had sufficient time to come to terms with his death. And if he hadn't, didn't the miracle of modern medicine have something to do with it? Here's an instance in which the very possibility of a cure, a possibility that, let me be clear, was entirely reasonable to hope for, and that would have been unthinkable not to pursue. But that very possibility may have robbed his death of its full meaning and distracted him from a frank consideration of his ultimate condition. How different would it have been had he been faced with the inevitability of his death some days and weeks before, as a terminal barrier looming before him like an insurmountable mountain? Would he have given more serious thought to it all? Might we have even had the conversation? And so we return to the paradox with which I began. It's a problem that's already been with us for a very long time. It's a variation on the theme that Aldous Huxley famously sounded in Brave New World. It's the shadow side of our growing mastery of the physical terms of our existence, a shadow that grows in tandem with the mastery. One sees the same thing in a much more banal, but also, for that reason, interesting and sobering phenomenon reported recently in the Chronicle of Higher Education. Two Vermont psychologists related therein that, quote, a steadily growing number of students who are struggling with depression, anxiety, sleep disorders, and other problems visit campus healthcare services for the sole purpose of refilling their prescriptions. They tell us, and I'm still quoting, they're not interested in working toward an understanding of their lives, but ask only that their regimens of psychotropic medications, antidepressants, Ritalin, tranquilizers, and others be continued or adjusted. Close quote. Unfortunately, one can't help but be disappointed in these psychologists' less than resounding arguments against such behavior, which amount to a rehearsing of theories of developmental appropriateness. The pill-popping students may be woefully mistaken, but they're not stupid. They're right to sense that there's nothing much of substance behind the psychotherapeutic curtain. If the soul is nothing more than chemistry, a collection of manipulable states, then why not skip the moralizing and just go ahead and manipulate them? Indeed, what these young people are doing mimics the modus operandi of much of the adult world. If we can comfortably forestall the cosmic questions until the last moment and beyond, then why not? Evasion, rather than belief or unbelief, is the watchword of our day. Woody Allen said, "I'm not afraid to die, I just don't want to be there when it happens." But this task of evasion will become more complex in the years to come. How will we make sense of death if it comes to be viewed as something with no intrinsic meaning, but chiefly a piece of bad luck, a matter of bad timing, the misfortune, for example, of contracting the disease before the march of inevitable medical progress has caught up with it? Or worse yet, how will we be reconciled to death when it comes to be understood as something almost entirely accidental and largely preventable? One can easily imagine that there will be surprisingly little room for joy or exuberance in such a world. More likely, it will be a tightly wound world, permeated with bitterness and anxiety and mutual suspicion, in which human life will be at one and the same time deeply devalued and fiercely guarded. With growing mastery comes growing responsibility and the need to assign accountability. In a world without God and without contingency, there will always be someone or something at the bottom of everything bad that happens. The moral economy of a controlled world will demand that a villain be produced. Someone must be to blame. It will always be a twitch of the surgeon's hand or a slip of the obstetrician's forceps, rather than the will of God or simply the imperfections of a fallen world that explains deformity and death. Not medicine alone, but every facet of modern life is vulnerable to this tyranny of mastery or illusion of mastery. We're entering an era in which there's likely to be more and more brisk market in scapegoats. There will be one or more for every ill, since we're now too smart to fall for the idea that anything could truly be beyond the reach of human agency. And calling something God's will is anything more than a rank mystification. But notwithstanding the proliferating need for scapegoats, much of the burden of blame will devolve upon ourselves. Since in being set free to choose so much about our lives, we will almost certainly find ourselves more and more anxious about or dissatisfied with the choices we make. It need hardly be pointed out that the expansion of choice does not necessarily make for the expansion of happiness. Consider this. Everyone knows the feeling of inexplicable relief that comes when a hard decision is taken out of our hands by the flow of events. That relief will become rarer. Everyone knows the aching hollowness of buyer's regret when we were allowed to make the call and we blew it. That ache will become more familiar. The more we claim mastery, the more it will all be our own fault.